Starting in the early 17th century, the kings of Sweden began to transform their burgeoning dominion into a mighty empire. King Gustavus Adolphus ascended the throne at the young age of 16 and rode his kingdom to military victory against foes that, at first glance, would have very easily defeated the economically poor and sparsely populated Sweden. Gustavus reformed Sweden's government, streamlining its bureaucracy, and more importantly, the kingdom's military. In reforming the military, Gustavus got rid of the traditional levy system and required that conscription records be kept by the local churches of all able-bodied men between the ages of 18 and 40. Gustavus had created a standing army. Inspired by the teachings of Maurice of Orange, Gustavus taught and schooled his troops in the continuous volley tactic, in which one row of infantry would fire, march to the back while reloading, and then repeat the process with the next row. By positioning his men in close-quarters formations, he was able to have the first row ready to reposition and resume the volley by the time the last row had stepped up and shot. Gustavus created the modern musketeer. One of Gustavus's famed inventions was the adoption of better artillery tactics. He aimed to provide his army with mobile defensive-offensive weaponry. While he kept heavier and thusly stationary cannons, Gustavus also made extensive use of smaller and lighter copper cannons. These smaller cannons could be pulled by fewer men and horses, making them much more maneuverable on the battlefield. Gustavus created modern artillery. In 1618, religious conflict in the region of Bohemia between Catholics and Protestants came to involve nearly the entirety of the Holy Roman Empire in Central Europe. In 1630, Gustavus Adolphus, a staunch Protestant, was drawn into the war and was given the golden opportunity to use his new reforms to good use. He led the Swedes to victory at Breitenfeld in 1631, only for his momentum to be killed at Lutzen the year after when he too was killed. Nonetheless, competent generals assumed his position and preserved Sweden's newfound military prosperity. Gustavus created modern warfare. Gustavus's successors built an empire focused on the Baltic Sea, a vital trade region. Control over the sea's ports and trade routes was highly desirable. The countries that bordered the sea, such as the Danes, Poles, and the Russians, saw the potential benefits of securing access to these valuable trade routes and sought to solidify their economic interests. Fortunately for Sweden, they had a near monopoly. King Charles XI became king in 1660 and aimed to build upon Sweden's age of great power. Charles XI implemented sweeping administrative changes. He centralized power, reduced the influence of the ancient landed nobility, and strengthened the monarchy's authority. This absolute monarchy style of governance aimed to increase government efficiency and ensure uniformity across the realm. Charles XI also led Sweden to military victory. The Scanian War in the 1670s saw Sweden fight against a coalition of Denmark-Norway, Brandenburg-Prussia, and the Dutch Republic. Luckily for Sweden, its military prowess led Sweden to a rather favorable peace treaty, acquiring the region of Skane from Denmark, which today remains part of Sweden. Sweden's prosperity and hegemony over the Baltic Sea left the Danes, Poles, and Russians thirsting for their Baltic dominions. All three shared one common goal: defeat Sweden and wrestle control of the Baltic for themselves. By the year 1700, the Tsardom of Russia was still emerging from the shadows of its medieval past. Under the rule of Tsar Peter the Great, Russia was undergoing a transformative era of modernization and expansion. Peter had a vision to westernize Russia, pulling it into the modern world. To do this, however, Peter needed a port on the Baltic Sea that would allow Russia to export its goods to the wider world, or project its power across the seas. Sweden had conquered the region of Ingria from the Russians in 1618, which once provided the Russians with a coast on the Baltic Sea, and Peter looked to take it back. Augustus II, the Elector of Saxony, was elected to rule the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1697, coming to control much of Eastern Europe with various ethnicities, languages, and religious groups under his rule. Much like Charles XI, Augustus sought to transform Poland-Lithuania into a hereditary absolute monarchy, and much like Peter, sought to regain lost territories in Livonia from Sweden in modern-day Latvia. Frederick IV came to the throne of Denmark-Norway in 1699 and continued his predecessor's efforts in removing Swedish influence from his kingdoms. Frederick II sought to transform his rule into an absolute one and regain Skane from Sweden in the process. On April 5, 1697, Charles XI died, leaving his only living son and heir, the young 14-year-old Charles XII, to inherit the throne. Charles XII was notably stubborn, independent, and ambitious, three characteristics that would be ever present in the events of the coming years. Peter, Augustus, and Frederick all recognized that if there ever was an opportunity to regain lost territory and check Swedish power, it would be right now, while the new Swedish king was young, weak, and unprepared. Between 1698 and 99, Frederick organized the creation of a new coalition between the three powers to do just that. Fighting began in the April of 1700 as Danish troops invaded Schleswig, owned by the Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, an ally of Sweden. Charles took to executing a bold and daring move with youthful vigor. With the help of English and Dutch fleets, Charles outmaneuvered the Danish fleet and landed 4,000 men near the Danish capital, Copenhagen. After a 6-day bombardment of the city in June, the Danes signed the Treaty of Travendal and were forced out of the war. With Danish capitulation, Charles was free to ship his army from Denmark and into Livonia in October, braving rapidly freezing waters and cold autumn storms. Augustus had been besieging the Swedish city of Riga with 18,000 Saxons, as he was unable to secure a war declaration from the Polish-Lithuanians. Unfortunately for Charles, the Saxons had retreated from Riga just as he landed. The focus now shifted to Peter. When the war started earlier in the year, Peter was busy fighting the Ottoman Turks. He was able to secure a peace deal that allowed him to invade Swedish-held Ingria in August. Peter was quick to muster up and train an army, although its soldiers and its officer corps were new and ill-trained. Nonetheless, by November, his army reached the city of Narva, a strategic gateway to the Baltics, with 40,000 men. Charles only had 8,000 marching from Riga. Narva was well fortified, and the cold November rain, now turning into sleet, forced the Russians to construct earthworks and begin a siege of the city. On November 30th, Charles commenced his brave attack as a brief window of clear weather allowed him to. Just then, a snowstorm descended onto the field. The snowstorm was a help, as it blinded the Russians and disguised how few Swedes were advancing against them. The Swedes descended on the earthworks, cutting down any poor Russian that they came across with volley fire or cold steel blades. Hundreds attempted to flee through the single bridge that crossed the freezing Narva River. Under the weight of hundreds of panicked men and horses, the bridge collapsed. Charles's first major battle in his life was a stunning success. Swedish casualties were amazingly low, with some 667 dead and around 1,200 wounded. Most accounts agree that the Russians lost up to 15,000 dead and wounded. After Narva, Charles was faced with two choices: either invade Russia while Peter was still vulnerable, or turn around and deal with Augustus. He chose the latter, giving Peter much-needed breathing space. Charles wintered in Livonia over the winter and began his invasion of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in July of 1701. It took nearly a full year before Augustus confronted Charles on the field of battle, and by that time already, the daring Swedish king had captured the city of Warsaw. On the 19th of July, a combined Saxon and Commonwealth force confronted the Swedes at the swampy countryside of Klissow on the road to Krakow. Much like at Narva, Charles was again outnumbered. And much like Narva, Charles's troops left the battlefield victorious and with lesser casualties than their enemy. In the aftermath of the battle, Charles proceeded to occupy Krakow, and a significant portion of Poland along with it. Another victory at Pultusk in 1703 gave Charles the confidence to install his puppet king onto the thrones of Poland-Lithuania, Stanislas Leszczynski. Even then, Augustus continued to resist the Swedes from his hereditary electorate of Saxony. This came to an end when the Swedish commander Rehnskiöld, with 9,000 troops, massacred an 18,000-strong combined army of Saxons and Russians at the Battle of Fraustadt in early 1706. A Swedish invasion of Saxony and the capture of Leipzig later that year resulted in the Treaty of Altrandstedt. Augustus abdicated the Commonwealth in favor of Stanislaus and was forced to end his alliance with Peter. Peter also sued for peace, but the ambitious Swedish king decided to press his already extraordinary luck. While Charles was busy romping through Poland, Peter took the time to recompile his army. He put great effort into modernizing, westernizing, and expanding it, reshaping it to be a formidable match for their next encounter with Charles's main army. Peter had also created a navy that, too, would stand up against the Swedish. In 1703, Peter restarted his invasion of Ingria. After taking the fortress of Nynskans at the mouth of the Neva River, he tore it down and, in its place, erected the Peter and Paul fortress amongst the swampy marshlands. The Peter and Paul fortress became the core of Peter's ultimate dream of having a window to the west, a grand city that would open up Russia to the world. In the years that followed, even as the war dragged on, this new city of St. Petersburg began to take the shape of its Western European contemporaries. Peter made sure that his new capital would be built no matter the cost, even if the cost summed up to be tens of thousands of poor peasants and serfs dead because of exhaustion, disease, and back-breaking forced labor. Peter, however, had to solidify his hold on Ingria to ensure that St. Petersburg could be built in the first place, something that Charles could not stand. In the winter of 1708, Charles marched out of Poland with 45,000 men and straight towards, not St. Petersburg, but Moscow, to take the Russian capital. On July 4th, Charles's army clashed with a numerically superior enemy at Holauxin. The marshy terrain forced the Swedish army to abandon their traditional aggressive charges with bayonets and pikes and instead resort to a fierce exchange of musket fire. Musket fire, however, was enough to whittle down the morale of the uncoordinated Russians. At the end of the day, Holauxin became another name on the list of Swedish victories. As the Swedes continued their march deeper into Russia, Peter aimed to make them suffer. Ruthless, scorched earth policies witnessed Russian troops burn and destroy everything of potential use in the path of Charles's forces: wheat, livestock, and even grazing ground for the Swedish cavalry. For every mile gained, the hardened Swedish troops could see smokestacks from burning villages rise in the distance. The Swedes were running desperately low on supplies to continue their march to Moscow. Charles's commanders persuaded him to turn the advance southward, towards Ukraine, which was relatively intact. There, they would meet up with Mazepa, the hetman of a group of rebelling Cossacks, who were seeking to build an independent Cossack state. Charles would also meet up with a Swedish supply train in Ukraine as well. However, these urgently needed supplies were intercepted by the Russians at Lesnaya in October, in modern-day Belarus. The winter of 1708 to 1709 proved to be one of the worst in European history in general. The British knew it as the Great Frost. The French called it the Great Winter. Even in warm Portugal, rivers froze and palm trees sank in the snow. Throughout Europe, frozen fish floated in the water, deer lay dead in the meadows, livestock froze to death in the stables, and birds fell to the ground like stones. By the spring, Charles had lost over half of his original army to the cold. In the spring of 1709, Charles continued his march to Moscow, now approaching from the southwest. In his way were several fortified cities that would impede his advance, and the first of them was Poltava, in modern-day Ukraine. At the advice of Mazeppa, Charles began besieging the city with what little resources he had. Peter marshaled his forces in response, an army of 42,500 soldiers and 102 cannons. On July 10th, the decisive clash was planned to begin. The situation took a tense turn when Charles learned of a Kalmyk army reinforcing the Russians. Faced with this worrying prospect, he opted to make a preemptive strike on the enemy encampments. In the early morning of July 8th, the Swedish infantry advanced, and for some time it looked as if Charles would win. The Swedish charge overran the Russian earthworks, but did not bother to actually hold them, and instead press on toward Peter's main defensive lines. As the day progressed, both Peter and Charles ordered their forces to push forward. The Russian artillery was relentless, leading to chaos in the Swedish lines. Exhausted, weary, and low on supplies, panic set in among the Swedish ranks. Their center collapsed, and a disorganized retreat began towards the Swedish encampment, which was ultimately captured by Russian forces. The Swedish army, which was once seemingly invincible, had suffered a resounding and decisive defeat at Poltava. Out of the 16,000 Swedes that participated in the battle, over 9,300 died, and approximately 2,900 were taken prisoner. In the chaos, Charles fled the battlefield, a wounded man, having been shot in the foot. He and the utmost best of his troops sought refuge in Ottoman Moldavia. The Ottoman Sultan, Ahmed III, graciously allowed Charles to take refuge in Ottoman territory. Charles and his men stayed in a new Swedish colony in Moldova called Bender, with Ahmed paying for its construction and expenditures out of pocket. While under Ottoman protection, Charles set about planning his revenge against the Russians, rather than gratefully counting his blessings in exile. Charles was eager to pull the Ottomans into his conflict with Russia, lobbying the Sultan extensively to declare war. Through a mixture of Charles's skillful lobbying and the Ottoman Empire's own concerns, a large Turkish force was assembled to confront the Russians. Peter, by this point, was already angered by the Ottomans' refusal to expel Charles upon his demands, and began dispatching a force to meet the Turks. In the July of 1711, the Pruth River Campaign began, as Peter marched his army, 60,000 strong, into modern-day Romania. Peter would then be outmaneuvered by the Turks, who had a numerically superior force, and pinned against the Pruth River. Rather than use this tactical advantage, Ahmed entered negotiations with Peter. The Treaty of the Pruth focused on Turkish aims, with minor territorial concessions being made along the Black Sea. Ahmed offered the safe passage of Charles back to Sweden as part of the clauses, but a stubborn Charles became an unruly one. Charles refused to leave his safety in Moldova. Charles's stay increasingly became more and more expensive for the Ottoman government, being given the nickname of Fixed Asset Charles, referring to the amount of money the Turks had to set aside each year to host him. In 1713, the Ottoman government had enough and placed Charles under house arrest after fighting broke out in Bender. Charles finally left for good in late 1714. As Charles refused to leave Moldavia, Denmark, Norway, Saxony, and Russia were free to do as they pleased to the exhausted Swedish Empire. To make matters worse for Sweden, more countries joined the fray. Brandenburg, Prussia joined the coalition in 1710, looking to gain Swedish Pomerania. In 1713, the Elector of Hanover, who would soon become George I of Great Britain, also joined. In the king's absence, Sweden was governed by the Swedish Council, which desperately scraped together resources to raise new armies. After his victory at Poltava, Peter invaded Poland and toppled Charles's puppet king, Stanislaus, replacing him with Augustus. Peter also took the opportunity to occupy Sweden's Baltic provinces and commence a campaign along the coast of Finland. Putting the Russian navy to good use, the Battle of Gambit in 1714 secured Russian dominance in the Baltic Sea. The Danes, Saxons, and Poles focused on Sweden's possessions in modern-day northern Germany. An attempt to lift the coalition-led siege at Stralsund on the Baltic coast resulted in Swedish victory at the Battle of Gottebusch in 1712. Charles's return to Sweden in 1714 breathed new life into the war effort. He was able to patch together a 60,000-strong army, this time to invade Norway. This new campaign, however, would be his last. Charles would be shot clean through the head while inspecting the earthworks at the siege of Fredrikstad on December 11th, 1718. Whether it was by a lucky Danish bullet or a conspirator amongst the ranks, no one knows. If Poltava hadn't already, the death of Sweden's king solidified the outcome of the war. In 1719, Russian war parties began landing all along the eastern coast of Sweden, burning down farms and whole cities, and pillaging whatever they came across. The Swedish government sued for peace. The two treaties of Stockholm saw Sweden cede Bremen to Hanover and Pomerania to Brandenburg, Prussia. The Treaty of Frederiksborg with the Danes got rid of Sweden's tax exemption from the Sound, the strategic waterway crisscrossing the Danish islands. The final peace treaty, the Treaty of Nystad with the Russians, was signed on September 10, 1721. Compared to the other treaties, it was the most consequential for Sweden. Sweden's Baltic provinces, as well as Ingria and parts of Finland, were ceded to Russia. When it came to the Saxons and Poles, no formal treaty was signed. The Swedes and the Commonwealth simply returned to the pre-war status quo. The end of the Great Northern War in 1721 also ended the Swedish Empire, reduced to the status of a minor power. In the coming years, Sweden embraced a period of reform and modernization known as the Age of Liberty. During the Age of Liberty, Sweden transformed politically. The old absolutist monarchy gave way to a constitutional monarchy, with the Riksdag, the Swedish parliament, gaining more power. The Enlightenment ideals of individual rights and representative government gained traction. Across the Gulf of Finland, Peter saw it fit to celebrate his victory by officially transforming his Tsardom of Russia into the Russian Empire. Russia was now the dominant player in the Baltic Sea. Peter's sweeping reforms modernized and westernized Russia, propelling his empire onto the global stage. European politics could no longer be played without also factoring the Russians in. At the end of the day, Charles XII and the Great Northern War can be used as a stark reminder that unchecked ambitions, blind pride, and not knowing when to stop can lead to devastating consequences, just as it had for Sweden.